What's up, everyone? Blackwell here. Today I'm going over an updated Uzuri deck tech for Classic Constructed. Uzuri is a disruptive hero that relies on using attack reactions to push through powerful on-hit effects. Chief among these is her hero ability. What it allows you to do is swap out an attack with stealth on the combat chain for an attack action with cost 2 or less. Usually these are going to be attack actions with disruptive effects such as Shakedown. Now, one note about Uzuri's ability is how it works is as an attack reaction, you banish a card from your hand face down, then your opponent has an opportunity to respond to it before this is swapped into the combat chain for the stealth card. So just keep that in mind. A lot of opponents will respond to you banishing it with a defense reaction if they have one in order to play around Command and Conquer, which is one of the cards you can swap in, and that's something that you can use to either play around what your opponent's doing or use it to your advantage if you want to try and get a defense reaction out of your opponent that you think is there. Moving on to the equipment, let's go over the daggers first. I'm running all of the daggers except for Graven Call. At the moment, I think Graven Call will be more of an Arachne card than an Uzuri card because it itself does not have a disruptive effect. In most matchups, you're going to be running Spider's Bite and Nerve Scalpel. Spider's Bite mainly as the attacking piece, and then Nerve Scalpel as a interaction with Flick Knives, which we'll go over in a moment. Sometimes you'll want to be attacking with Nerve Scalpel, though, especially if you're against an opponent that you know is running defense reactions, but wants to keep a lot of attack actions in their hand. Attacking with your Nerve Scalpel makes it more awkward for them to use those defense reactions effectively. Scale Peeler comes in against heroes that have a lot of equipment block, especially temper equipment. If you don't know, the way that Scale Peeler will interact with temper equipment is that because it reduces the defense of the temper equipment by 1, a temper 2 equipment blocking after this is hit will destroy it. A similar interaction happened with Shred. This is very powerful in those matchups. And then Orbitoclast comes in most commonly against Kano. It's very awkward for a Kano player to deal with because if you start the turn off with this, they have to sort of commit then to whether or not they're blocking. Otherwise, all of their things are going to block for 2 because they mostly play attack, non-attack actions. Moving more into the equipment, we have Flick Knives. So the way Flick Knives works with defense reactions is you are able to respond to a defense reaction after it's played, but before it's added to the combat chain. So if you Flick Knives a Nerve Scalpel, in response, it will reduce the defense of the defense reaction by 1. So this can be useful for pushing through an on-hit effect, such as with the Leave No Witnesses. Leave No Witnesses has a clean 4 attack against the 4 block that many common defense reactions have. So if you Flick Knives the Nerve Scalpel, it'll make your Leave No Witnesses hit. Please note this interaction doesn't work with any of the other daggers in the same manner. Next up, we have Fyendal's Spring Tunic in the chest slot. There aren't a lot of other great options for Assassin right now in the chest slot, but Fyendal's Spring Tunic, the extra resource it provides every 3 turns, allows you to use your 1-cost attacks a lot more efficiently, stuff like Death Touch or Looking for a Scrap, as well as do some fun tricks with things like Codex of Frailty, where you could pitch a blue to a dagger, have 1 floating, play a Codex of Frailty, return a Command and Conquer, activate Tunic, and then now you have the ability to play that Command and Conquer, whereas normally you'd have to overpitch in order to achieve that. Next up, we have Mask of Perdition and Black Tech Whisperers. Both of these are Battleworn equipment that have an attack reaction effect and can be rebought for 2 silver at the start of your turn. Mask of Perdition banishes an additional card from your opponent's deck on hit for the card that you attack react it to. This can help you trigger your contracts more. It also threatens an attack reaction to activate Shakedown, whose ability is dependent on you having activated an attack reaction this combat chain. Black Tech Whisperers, similar effect, except it gives an assassin attack action on hit go again. Note that because this is on hit go again, it's fairly easy to get blown out by a defense reaction. So try and be patient with this. Save it for when you have a shred as backup because you don't want to leave yourself stranded without this when you need it. Next up, we're running 2 AB. Against Kano, you bring in both AB. Against Runeblade, you bring in 1 AB. Note that you never really want to have both Flick Knives and only 1 Dagger, so you're not often going to have this setup. It will be this as your AB piece if you're only running one AB, because you don't want to flick knives when you only have one dagger and leave yourself completely without a weapon. Moving on to the main deck, I've got a 60 card main deck here as well as sideboard, which we'll get into afterwards. We have our disruptive attacks here. These are the main source of damage in your deck as well as your main disruptive effects. Command and Conquer is a Flesh and Blood staple. It threatens Arsenal and cannot have defense reactions played to it. This can interact well with your Isolate cards or your Backstab in order to threaten your opponent's Arsenal effectively. Do note that this is not an Assassin attack action, and you do have some cards that care specifically about Assassin attacks, so keep that in mind. What you can do for those, if you're swapping this in off of a Stealth card, is, for example, play a Stealth card, your opponent defends, you can play a Shred, which cares specifically about Assassin attacks, on the defending card, and then you swap in the Command and Conquer, and you'll get the effect of that Shred. Shakedown, if you've activated an attack reaction, this chain link will, on hit, allow you to name a color, your opponent reveals their hand, and you banish a card of the chosen color. Some opponents will go to immediately put their hand down when this hits. Make sure that they know you have to name a color first. You don't want to, accidentally gain an advantage over your opponent in that way. Note that also Shakedown itself is not a contract card, but if you already have a different contract card on the combat chain, its banish can trigger it. Already Dead is a contract. The main disruptive effect that it has is to banish a card from the top of your opponent's deck and a defending card on hit, and it makes silver off of non-action cards, so things like instants, reactions, or equipment. And that's correct, it can banish equipment. So the threat of Already Dead can be very powerful with your stealth cards, because if your opponent wants to commit equipment to it, they have to consider, is it something that I'm able to lose if my opponent throws in an Already Dead, especially with important equipment such as Teklo Foundry Heart or Flamescale Furnace that can oftentimes be essential to a hero's game plan. Death Touch gives your opponent an affliction on hit, frailty, inertia, or blood rot. A lot of times, as far as which one you want to use, you want to just do the math on which one would be better. So, for example, it usually doesn't make sense to give your opponent a frailty over a blood rot unless you think they're going to play 2 or more attacks as either weapons or from Arsenal. Death Touch can only be played from Arsenal or swapped in with Uzuri, so keep that in mind. It can be very awkward if you get multiples in hand, but there's ways around that with cards that cycle. But it's also very powerful if played from Arsenal. So if you do something else on one of your turns, then your last card in hand is Death Touch, you Arsenal it. If you have a Tunic ticking up to 3, then this is potentially a 1-card hand, which is one of the stronger 1-card hands in the deck. Next up, we have some contract attacks. We have Leave No Witnesses, Plunder the Poor, and Annihilate the Armed. These will all banish a card from the top of your opponent's deck on hit. Leave No Witnesses will also banish a card from their arsenal, and they each have different triggers for making silver. Annihilate the Armed makes silver off of attack actions. Plunder the Poor makes them off of cards with cost 0 or 1, and Leave No Witnesses makes them off of red cards. So these contract effects do stack on the combat chain. So for example, if you've already attacked with an Annihilate the Armed, you've given it Go Again, say from your Black Tech Whisperers, and then you come in with Leave No Witnesses. If Leave No Witnesses hits and banishes a red attack action, you would get 2 silver for that, as long as these are all still on the combat chain. Next up, we have some Go Again cards. We have Looking for a Scrap and Enlightened Strike. Enlightened Strike requires you to put a card from the bottom of your deck as an additional cost to play it, and it can either get Go Again, +2, or allow you to draw a card. Looking for a Scrap is 1 for 4. If you banish a card with 1 attack from your graveyard as an additional cost to play it, it'll get +1 and Go Again. So also potentially Go Again. These cards are very flexible and a great way to go wide. One note on Looking for a Scrap is that your daggers do count as 1 attack cards in order to banish. So if you flick knived a dagger, you can banish it to Looking for a Scrap. The reason going wide in a deck like Uzuri that normally focuses on disruptions on just one attack can be good is because the threat of that disruption later means your opponent is oftentimes not incentivized to block these, and so they're a good way to push through damage in a deck that otherwise may struggle to do a lot of damage quickly. And as your opponent gets lower in Uzuri, they have to play less efficiently because there's that threat of, oh, if my opponent has a couple attack reactions, I may just be dead. So I need to play around that, compensate for that, and sometimes that can allow you to bluff or force your opponent to play not as efficiently as they would in the early game. Now we're getting into some of the stealth attacks, beginning with a full rainbow set of isolates. Isolate has both stealth and dominate. The way this interacts with Uzuri's ability is your opponent has to commit to blocking the stealth card first, and then you activate her ability and switch it in. So once you've swapped something in, your opponent would only be able to use defense reactions or instants if they want to block additionally. So this is one of your best ways to push through damage. Oftentimes the number of isolates you're running will be greater than the number of defense reactions your opponent is running. So once your opponent runs out of those in the early game, isolate can all but guarantee that you hit. So in some of the slower matchups like Guardian, you want to kind of play it slow, keep in mind how many defense reactions your opponents have already used, and then pull ahead later in the game. Next up, the other blue stealth attacks. We have Backstab, Infect, and Sedate. Backstab works well with Command and Conquer because you can't play defense reactions to Backstab's Chain Link. So if you go Backstab into a Command and Conquer, there's no point at which your opponent is able to play a defense reaction. Infect is one of the more threatening stealth attack actions in blue by itself because it makes a Blood Rot on hit. So even though it's a blue, it's threatening up to 3 damage. So this can be really good to if your opponent is trying to like call your bluff of like playing a stealth and they're just like, I don't think they have it, or I'm gonna wait and use a defense reaction until after they swap their card in. If you just say, okay, I'll pass, and it's like, okay, well, now I didn't block this one attack card. Do I really want to use this defense reaction on it or not? So it's not super great, but of the blue stealth options we have, it's one of the best. Sedate, I just need an additional one, and Inertia is at least somewhat relevant against all heroes. Do note that the blue stealth actions are how you enable looking for a scrap. So you want to try to block with at least one of these early game in order to enable a looking for scrap later. Rounding out the attacks, we have Surgical Extraction. This is another blue. It's a contract card with on hit, banish the top card of the opponent's deck, and then look at their hand and banish a card, and it makes silvers off of blue cards. This is a little more difficult to make hit because it's only 4 attack, and it does cost 2, but you can swap it in off of Uzuri's ability, and you can back it up with a Shred. This is one of the most powerful disruptive abilities you have access to, but it can be difficult to land early in the game. If you pitch it away for later, though, once your opponent has used a lot of their defense reactions and maybe pitch it with some yellow and blue shreds, it can be a great way to finish up in the late game. Next up, we have Codex of Frailty. I could probably do an entire video just about how to play Codex of Frailty, but what it does is it allows you to get a card from your graveyard back into your arsenal, and your opponent does the same. Each person who puts an attack action card from their graveyard to their arsenal discards a card. Then you create a Ponder, your opponent creates a Frailty. The most common way you're going to use this is to get back a Leave No Witnesses, because it's 4 attack, so it's at a break point. It costs 0, so you can play it with a 1-card hand off of Codex Frailty, and it threatens whatever card your opponent just put in the arsenal. So not only did they have to discard if their arsenal was open, they now have to commit at least 1, potentially 2 cards to block this if they then want to save that arsenal. And since they've already discarded, their options are low there. So this is one of the best ways to take back tempo on an empty hand. Do note that you almost always want to try and get your hand empty before Codex Frailty, so you don't pay that penalty of discarding a card, and then the Ponder replaces itself. Another way to use Codex Frailty effectively is either to get extra resources floating by overpitching. So if you don't know, overpitching is if, say, I pitch a red and then a blue to something that costs 2, I would leave myself with 2 floating. Codex Frailty used in that way allows you to play a Command and Conquer, which has similar effects to Leave No Witnesses from Arsenal, but is just that much more difficult to block. You can also pull this off by, say, pitching a blue to a Dagger and then activating a Tunic on 3 to get back up to 2 resources. Next up, we have yellow and blue shreds. These are your main attack reactions you're going to use to help push through those on-hit effects. Because they're yellow and blue, they can be pitched away if you don't need them, which is very important because shred is a card you're able to brick with. It relies on your opponent defending, so if they don't defend, you're just stuck with it. So for that reason, you may play this card somewhat unintuitively, pitching it to a Dagger when maybe you want to hold on to it later in the turn, but you don't want to brick yourself, say if you have 2 shreds in hand. So just keep that in mind. It can be a dangerous card to Arsenal in that way, because if your opponent doesn't defend, then you've got this stuck in Arsenal when, say, maybe you draw a Codex Frailty the next turn and you can't play it now because you've got this stuck in Arsenal. Next up, we have 2 Spreading Plagues. Unlike shreds, these do not specify assassin attack actions, so you can play this on a Command and Conquer. This creates X Bloodrot tokens under the defending hero's control, where X is the number of cards defending this combat chain. Note that this does include equipments. They count as cards for these purposes. Spreading Plague can be a great way to close out the late game because it forces your opponent into a situation where, they're close enough to dead already that they have to block, and then Spreading Plague can deal a lot of damage to them. It is one of the reasons you may want to play an attack action such as a Shakedown or a Command and Conquer by pitching a blue rather than coming in with a stealth attack, because it will leave you that 1 resource floating to be able to use this. Usually you want to try and pitch this away for later in the game. Since it's a yellow, it's not that hard to do. Then lastly, we have Sink Below. This is just a strong defensive card that can allow you to cycle a card in your hand, help you unbrick things like multiple shreds, multiple death touches, multiple Codex Frailties, and can be great in the aggressive matchups or matchups that have dominate and overpower effects. Moving on into the sideboard now. We have Down and Dirties. These come in for Dromai. They are 6 attack actions that can defend from Arsenal, so it's mostly used for popping dragons. I'm expecting Dromai might fall off a bit now that Heavy Hitters is released, because Brute is a difficult matchup for Dromai, so she might get pushed out of the meta. If that happens, then these can probably be swapped out for something else. Right now I like having them just because Dromai is one of your worst matchups. Fate Foreseen fills a similar role to Sink Below as being a powerful defensive card against either aggressive decks or decks that present dominate and overpower effects. It's not quite as good as Sink Below because it lacks that cycling ability, but it still comes in for the matchups where you want to be a bit more defensive. Next up, we have 2 red shreds. In contrast to the defense reactions, these shreds come in when you want to be more aggressive. So against, say, control decks. Some of the slower dash decks, some of the slower guardian decks. It just helps you get that extra push through defense reactions that your opponent may have. Oasis Respite comes in against Kano because it's one of the only ways to interact with his combo turn. Against Kano, you generally just want to keep this in Arsenal and only use it when they start to go for that combo, with stuff like Aether Wildfire, Aether Flare. If you save it till then, they have a very hard time winning. You also want to bring this in against heroes that use a lot of attack reactions or dominate effects, just because it can be a good way to help play around that in addition to your defense reactions. So stuff like Bravo, Dorinthia, or the Uzuri Mirror. So that's all for this deck tech. I hope you enjoyed it. I tried to keep it a little bit shorter and more succinct than my previous one, but let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, and maybe I can do a follow-up video going over some mechanics in more detail. Thank you, and have a good day.